He had conquered the greatest empire on earth, and then his own men nearly destroyed him. Not Persia, not Darius, not some forgotten enemy king from the east. The most dangerous threat Alexander the Great ever faced would not come from across a battlefield. It would rise from inside his own camp, from the exhausted blood-soaked army that had followed him to the edge of the known world. These were the men who had made him invincible, the men who had bled for him, worshipped him, feared him, and obeyed him. And one day, after years of impossible victories, they looked at the man they once called king, and began to wonder if he had become something else entirely, a tyrant, a madman, or worse, a god who no longer cared whether they lived or died. And that is where this story truly begins. Because the rebellion of Alexander's own army was not a single dramatic moment, it was a slow-burning collapse of trust, a psychological war that built over years of conquest, humiliation, homesickness, and blood. It was the moment when one of history's greatest military machines began to crack from within, and if it had broken completely, the entire legend of Alexander the Great might have ended not with glory, but with mutiny, betrayal, and a corpse abandoned somewhere deep in Asia. To understand how that almost happened, you have to go back, before the rebellion, before the shouting in the rain, before the officers trembled in silence, before hardened Macedonian veterans openly defied the most feared conqueror alive. You have to return to the beginning, to the kingdom of Macedon, where a restless prince grew up under the shadow of a father who had already begun reshaping the ancient world. Macedon was not Athens, it was not Sparta, it was not a polished city-state draped in philosophy and marble. To many southern Greeks, Macedon was rough, half-civilized, and dangerously ambitious. But under King Philip II, it became something far more important than respectable. It became deadly. Philip was a military genius and political predator. He transformed Macedon into a war machine built on discipline, innovation, and brutal efficiency. He reformed the phalanx, armed his infantry with the long sarissa pike, sharpened cavalry tactics, crushed rivals, and bent Greece to his will. By the time his son Alexander was growing into manhood, the kingdom he would inherit was already armed like a blade pointed toward the east. And Philip had a target in mind: Persia, the old enemy, the vast empire that had once invaded Greece and now seemed vulnerable to revenge. For generations, Greeks had imagined the humiliation of turning the tables on the Persian kings. Philip intended to make that dream real, but before he could launch the invasion that would define his dynasty forever, he was murdered, and into that vacuum stepped Alexander. He was barely 20 years old, young enough to be underestimated, dangerous enough to make that mistake fatal. Everything was about to change. Alexander inherited not just a throne, but a fragile coalition held together by fear, loyalty, and his father's unfinished vision. He moved with astonishing speed. Rivals were eliminated, rebellions were crushed. The Greek cities were reminded, violently, that Macedon still ruled. The destruction of Thebes was a warning written in fire and rubble. Resist, and this is what happens. Then Alexander turned east. At first, everything seemed to confirm what his soldiers wanted to believe about him. He was brilliant in battle, fearless to the point of insanity, and impossibly lucky. He crossed into Asia Minor and smashed Persian forces at the Granicus River. Then came Hyphasis, where he defeated King Darius the Rid himself. Then Tyre, where he showed the world what happened to cities that refused him. Then Egypt, where he was welcomed like a liberator and crowned like a pharaoh. Then Gaugamela, where he broke the Persian Empire in one colossal gamble. Victory after victory, city after city, gold, silver, jewels, slaves, horses, armor, prestige. For the soldiers who marched with him, it must have felt as if they were walking through history while it was being written. But hidden inside those victories was a problem that would grow more dangerous with every mile eastward. Conquering was one thing, stopping was another. And Alexander did not know how to stop. At first, that seemed like greatness, a king who never accepted limits, a commander who believed there was always another victory waiting beyond the horizon. But the same trait that made him legendary also made him terrifying. Because eventually, every army has a breaking point. Every soldier has a private line beyond which glory no longer feels worth the cost. And Alexander kept dragging his men closer to that line. At the beginning, the army marched with purpose. They were avenging Greece, defeating Persia, enriching Macedon, and serving a king who seemed chosen by fate. But after Persia fell, after Darius was broken, after Persepolis was taken and its treasures looted, a quiet question began to haunt the ranks. What now? That question would become poison. Because once the official war was won, Alexander did not turn back toward home. He kept going. Into lands his men did not understand, through deserts, mountains, and foreign courts, into campaigns that no longer felt like revenge or liberation, but like obsession. The farther east he marched, the more his army began to suspect that they were no longer fighting for Macedon. They were fighting for Alexander's hunger, and that changed everything. But no one saw what came next. At first, the signs were small, a look exchanged between veterans, a muttered complaint in camp, the kind of bitter humor soldiers use when they no longer trust the speeches of their commanders. But Alexander, like many men who rise too fast and too high, had begun to change in ways his army could feel before they could fully name. He had conquered Persia, and then, in the eyes of many Macedonians, he began to become Persian. This was not just about clothing, though that mattered. It was not just about court ceremony, though that too would become explosive. It was about identity, power, loyalty. It was about the terrifying possibility that the king they had followed across the world was slowly abandoning the people who made him king in the first place. Alexander had practical reasons for adapting Persian customs. He was no fool. He knew that if he wanted to rule a vast empire, he could not govern it like a tribal warlord from Macedon forever. He needed Persian nobles, Persian administrators, Persian legitimacy. He needed to present himself not merely as a conqueror, but as the rightful successor to the great kings. Politically, it made sense. Emotionally, to his soldiers, it felt like betrayal. They had not marched thousands of miles, buried friends in foreign soil, and bled under burning suns so their king could start dressing like the people they had defeated. And yet that is exactly what seemed to be happening. He adopted elements of Persian royal dress. He surrounded himself with Eastern courtiers. He incorporated Persian elites into positions of favor. He embraced forms of ceremony that struck many Macedonians as humiliating, alien, and dangerously close to divine kingship. Among Greeks and Macedonians, kings were first among warriors, powerful, yes, glorious, yes, but still human, still men. Persian kingship was something else. It was distant, sacred, elevated beyond ordinary approach. And Alexander was drifting toward it. Everything was about to change. The deeper he moved into Asia, the more the old balance between king and army began to unravel. Macedonian soldiers had always tolerated hardship. They were not soft men. These were veterans of sieges, forced marches, cavalry charges, and hand-to-hand slaughter. They could endure almost anything if they believed there was an end to it. But under Alexander, the end kept moving. After Darius was defeated, the campaign should have been over. That is what many of the men believed. Persia had fallen. Its king had fled. Its capitals were broken. Its wealth was in Macedonian hands. By any normal standard, this was enough to make Alexander the greatest conqueror of his age. But enough was not a word Alexander understood. Instead of turning west, he pushed east into Bactria and Sogdiana, regions that were remote, mountainous, hostile, and maddeningly difficult to control. These were not the rich heartlands of the Persian Empire. These were wild frontier zones, where resistance was fragmented, local, and infuriatingly persistent. The enemy did not always stand in neat formations waiting to be crushed. They vanished into terrain, struck unexpectedly, and forced Alexander into brutal campaigns of pursuit and punishment. And that is where his army began to rot psychologically. Because glory is easy to sell in a decisive battle, it is much harder to sell an endless counterinsurgency. Weeks became months, months became years. The soldiers who had once charged at Gaugamela now found themselves climbing freezing passes, storming hill forts, chasing ghosts across barren land, and watching local rebellions reignite as soon as one region was pacified. The war no longer felt clean or meaningful. It felt sticky, exhausting, and impossible to finish. And every day, home grew farther away, but no one saw what came next. Alexander himself seemed to thrive in adversity. The harder the campaign, the more fiercely he pushed. He led from the front. He took reckless risks. He climbed walls first. He charged into battle with almost suicidal courage. To some, that remained inspiring. To others, it began to look like madness. Because what kind of king keeps gambling his life when the entire empire depends on him? What kind of commander demands superhuman endurance from men who have already given him everything? And what happens when the army starts to suspect that their king is no longer measuring victory in human terms at all? That suspicion deepened as Alexander's circle became more unstable. Conquest had brought unimaginable wealth and prestige, but it had also brought paranoia. The farther he rose, the more dangerous his inner world became. Friends became suspects, officers became threats. Loyalty was no longer assumed, it had to be constantly proved. And then came one of the first moments when Alexander's army truly saw something break. Philotas, the son of Parmenion, one of Alexander's most important generals. Philotas was arrogant, powerful and deeply embedded in the old Macedonian elite. He was not universally liked, but he represented something larger than himself. The older structure of trust that connected Alexander to the men who had served Philip and built the army he inherited. When a conspiracy against Alexander was uncovered, Philotas was accused of failing to report it. That alone was dangerous, but what followed was chilling. Philotas was arrested, interrogated, tortured and executed, and then Alexander ordered the killing of Parmenion as well. No trial, no defense, no chance to explain, just death. It was a strategic move, perhaps even a necessary one from Alexander's point of view. Leaving Parmenion alive after his son's execution would have been politically suicidal. But to the army, the message was unmistakable. No one was untouchable anymore, not even the men who had helped build Alexander's empire. That decision would alter history forever, because fear is a useful tool for ruling, but it is poison for trust. And once the army understood that even the oldest and most loyal companions of the king could be eliminated with terrifying speed, something changed inside the emotional structure of the campaign. They would still obey him, but now they would obey him differently, not only with devotion, with fear. And fear, over time, becomes resentment. Everything was about to change. Then came the drinking, the feasts, the tensions that alcohol always drags into the open. Alexander's court was not a calm place. It was a furnace of ambition, ego, suspicion, and identity crisis. Macedonian hardliners resented Persian influence. Persian nobles tried to adapt to the new order. Officers competed for favor. Alexander himself moved between extremes, charismatic and generous, one day, cold and terrifying the next. And in that atmosphere, one drunken argument would become one of the darkest moments of his life. Cleitus the Black had once saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus. He was not just another officer. He was part of the king's past, a man tied to the early campaigns, to old Macedonian loyalty, to the rough warrior culture Alexander increasingly seemed eager to outgrow. At a banquet, tensions erupted. Cleitus criticized Alexander. He mocked the king's growing Persian affectations. He reminded him, publicly and painfully, that his victories were not his alone, that Macedonian blood had won them, that Philip had laid the foundations, that Alexander was forgetting who he was. These were dangerous words, not because they were entirely false, but because they hit exactly where Alexander was most vulnerable. The conqueror who wanted to be more than Macedonian, more than king, more than man, was suddenly being dragged back down into the crude mortal world of memory and debt. And he snapped. In a fury, Alexander seized a spear and killed Cleitus. Killed him. His own man, his old companion, the man who had once saved his life. And for a moment, the entire illusion shattered. Because kings can execute traitors, kings can punish conspirators, but murdering a loyal veteran in drunken rage, that was something else. That was not the behavior of an invincible hero. That was the behavior of a man losing control. But no one saw what came next. Alexander was horrified afterward. Ancient sources describe him collapsing into grief, refusing food, overwhelmed by what he had done. And maybe that remorse was genuine. Maybe it was profound. But remorse does not unspill blood. It does not erase what the witnesses saw. The army had now seen two terrifying truths. First, their king was capable of destroying his own circle. Second, he was capable of doing it emotionally, impulsively, unpredictably. That combination is deadly. Because soldiers can follow a harsh commander. They can even follow a cruel one. But following a man who seems unstable is different. It creates a low, constant dread, not just of battle, of the king himself. Everything was about to change. And then Alexander made a mistake so politically explosive that it nearly detonated his entire relationship with the Macedonian elite. He tried to introduce proskynesis, This was a Persian court custom, involving a gesture of obeisance before the king. In Persian culture, it was part of royal protocol. In Zen, Greek and Macedonian eyes, it was something far more offensive, something dangerously close to worship. To bow low before a man in that way was not how free Macedonians treated their king, it was how subjects treated a god. Alexander may have believed this was a practical way to unify court culture between Greeks, Macedonians, and Persians. Or perhaps by this point he truly had begun to see himself as something beyond ordinary kingship. Either way, the reaction was explosive. The resistance was not subtle, it was moral, cultural, personal. To the Macedonians, this was not just bad policy, it was humiliation. It meant the king who had once fought beside them as a warrior among warriors was now asking them to kneel as if they were lesser beings, as if they were no longer his companions, as if they were subjects in an empire that no longer belonged to them. The backlash was so intense that Alexander had to retreat from fully enforcing it. But the damage was done. The idea had been spoken aloud. And once your soldiers begin to suspect that you want to be worshipped, the distance between king and army becomes very hard to close. But no one saw what came next. Because the rebellion that would truly test Alexander's control was still coming. And when it came, it would not happen in a palace or a banquet hall. It would happen after years of mud, wounds, dead friends, and impossible marching. At the edge of India, where Alexander would finally ask too much of the men who had followed him farther than any army had a right to go. By the time Alexander's army reached India, they were no longer the same men who had crossed into Asia with him. Some were older now, their bodies thick with scars, and their minds heavy with things they would never speak aloud. Others were dead, replaced by younger recruits and foreign auxiliaries who did not share the same memories, the same loyalty, or the same emotional bond to Macedon. The army still looked powerful from a distance, its standards still flew, its formation still moved with frightening discipline. But inside that polished exterior, exhaustion had begun to rot everything, and Alexander either did not see it or refused to. India was not simply another campaign. To his men, it felt like the end of the earth. The landscapes changed. The air changed. The rivers were wider, stranger, more violent. The monsoon rains transformed roads into swamps and battlefields into mud-choked nightmares. The animals were unfamiliar. The peoples and kingdoms they encountered seemed to belong to a world increasingly detached from the one the Macedonians had left behind years earlier. Home no longer felt distant, it felt unreal. That is what prolonged conquest does to an army. At first, soldiers count the days until return. Then they count the battles. Then the campaigns. Then slowly, they stop counting altogether. Because counting becomes a form of pain. Time begins to lose shape. Life becomes march, camp, battle, wound, sleep, march again. And in that condition men do not break all at once. They unravel quietly. Everything was about to change. The Indian campaign began with ambition and spectacle. Alexander was still chasing something no ordinary king would have chased. The edges of the known world, the limits of glory, perhaps even the idea of becoming a myth while still alive. To him, crossing into India was not madness. It was destiny. Another chapter, another impossible conquest waiting to be forced into existence. To his soldiers, it increasingly looked like insanity. And yet they kept following him. Because habit is powerful. Because fear is powerful. Because military obedience, once deeply ingrained, can carry men far beyond the point where they still believe in what they are doing. NGZ. They crossed rivers, subdued tribes, stormed fortifications, and advanced into lands that most Greeks and Macedonians could barely imagine. The campaign was brutal, confusing, and relentless. But then came the battle that pushed them closer to the edge than perhaps any before it. The Battle of the Hyphasis. There, Alexander faced King Porus, one of the most formidable opponents of his eastern campaigns. Porus was not Darius. He was not a collapsing imperial monarch fleeing from catastrophe. He was a hard local king with discipline, pride, and one weapon the Macedonians had never truly faced in this way before: war elephants. To modern eyes, elephants may seem almost theatrical, something from paintings and fantasy epics. But to ancient soldiers, they were monstrous, massive, armored, unpredictable walls of flesh and terror that could crush formations, panic horses, and turn battle into psychological chaos. Imagine being a Macedonian infantryman, already thousands of miles from home, standing in rain and mud while enormous beasts thunder toward you. shrieking, trampling, tearing through men and pikes. This was not a normal battle. This was nightmare warfare. Alexander won. Of course he won. That is the curse and brilliance of his story. Again and again he pushed into impossible situations and somehow forced victory out of them. He crossed the river in secret, outmaneuvered Porus, and eventually shattered his resistance through tactical brilliance and relentless pressure. But winning is not the same as escaping the cost. The Hyphasis was one of those victories that feels glorious in royal propaganda and horrifying to the men who survived it. The battle was vicious. The weather was miserable. The enemy was terrifying. Horses panicked at the elephants. Men were crushed underfoot. Formations were shredded. It was the kind of experience that lodges in the nervo, a system, and does not leave. And afterward, when the shouting stopped and the dead were counted, Alexander looked east, still east, and his men understood, perhaps with a kind of dread that chilled the blood, that he was not done. But no one saw what came next, because what lay ahead was not just more land, it was rumor, scale, terror. The soldiers began hearing stories about the kingdoms beyond the Hyphasis River, great powers with armies even larger than those they had already faced, with thousands more elephants, deeper populations, richer lands, and perhaps no end at all. Whether those stories were fully accurate almost does not matter. In war, perception can be as powerful as fact, and what Alexander's army perceived was this: there would always be another enemy, always another river, always another horizon, always another speech from the king explaining why just one more campaign was necessary. And something inside them finally gave way. This is the part of the story that matters most. Because armies do not mutiny only from fear. Fear can make men cling harder to command. They mutiny when fear combines with exhaustion, grief, alienation, and the sense that obedience has become meaningless. They mutiny when they no longer believe that the sacrifices being demanded of them lead anywhere except deeper into the mouth of death. That is where Alexander had led them. To a place where victory itself no longer felt like enough. Everything was about to change. When the army reached the Hyphasis River, Alexander wanted to go farther. Of course he did. He always did. He envisioned new conquests, new territories, new worlds to fold into his empire. Perhaps he believed that if he stopped now, history would somehow judge him as incomplete. Perhaps he feared the emptiness that comes when a man built entirely around forward motion is finally forced to stand still. Well, whatever was driving him, it was stronger than his ability to read the breaking point of his own men, and so he prepared to push onward. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary confrontations in military history. His army said no, not in whispers this time, not through glances, muttering, or drunken resentment, not through courtly resistance or symbolic offense. No, openly, collectively, decisively. The conqueror who had shattered Persia, burned capitals, crossed deserts, and defeated kings now stood before the very machine that made all of it possible, and discovered that it could refuse him. Imagine the shock of that moment. Imagine the silence in camp before the defiance was spoken aloud. Imagine the tension among the officers, many of whom must have felt torn between terror of the king and sympathy for the men. This was not merely a military disagreement, it was a political and emotional crisis. Because if Alexander could not command his army forward, what exactly was he now? A king without obedience is just a man wearing symbols. And for perhaps the first time since he began his conquests, Alexander was forced to confront the possibility that his will alone was no longer enough. Ancient accounts preserve the name of the man who gave voice to what the army felt, Cuinus. That matters, because mutinies often need a translator, someone high enough to speak without being instantly dismissed, brave enough to say what everyone knows but fears to utter. Cuinus became that voice. He reportedly told Alexander what no one else had dared to say so clearly. The men were exhausted. They had marched far enough. They had won enough. They wanted to go home. Simple words. Devastating words. Because beneath them was an accusation more painful than open rebellion. You have asked enough. You are no longer leading us toward greatness. You are consuming us. That decision would alter history forever. Alexander did not take it well. He was furious, hurt, humiliated, perhaps genuinely stunned that the men who had followed him through everything would now stop him at the very threshold of what he imagined as ultimate glory. He tried persuasion, he tried speeches, he tried invoking honor, destiny, and the shame of turning back. This had worked before. Alexander was a master of rhetoric when speaking to soldiers. He knew how to frame retreat as cowardice and advance as immortality. He knew how to make suffering sound sacred. But this time, the old magic failed, because speeches cannot repair bodies. They cannot resurrect dead friends. They cannot remove jungle rot from wounds, or wash years of grief from the soul. And they cannot make men believe in a dream that has become someone else's. The army stood firm, and that was the moment the rebellion truly became visible. Not because swords were drawn, not because tents were burned, but because obedience itself stopped. That is the deepest form of military rebellion. Not chaos, but refusal. Not frenzy, but collective stillness. The king commands. The army does not move. Everything was about to change. Alexander withdrew into his tent. That detail matters more than it seems. This was not merely a sulk. It was a psychological crisis. The man who had always moved history, by force of will, was now trapped in a space no battlefield tactics could solve. He could not simply charge this problem with cavalry. He could not outflank it. He could not kill one rebel leader and restore order. The resistance was too broad, too deep, too justified. His own success had made it possible, because this was not a weak or frightened army refusing him. This was a victorious army refusing him. Men who had already given him more than any king had a right to demand, me, and who had every reason to feel they had fulfilled their duty many times over. That made them morally dangerous. They were not cowards, and Alexander knew it. For 3 days, according to ancient tradition, he remained withdrawn, hoping perhaps that the army would crack first, that shame or fear would pull them back into line. But the mood did not shift. If anything, his silence probably deepened the tension. Outside, the soldiers waited. The officers waited. The officers waited. And then Alexander did something extraordinary. He yielded. Not willingly in his heart, perhaps. Not emotionally, but politically, strategically, and publicly. He yielded. He announced that the campaign would turn back. It is hard to overstate how significant that was. Alexander the Great, who had built his entire identity on unstoppable forward motion, had just been stopped, not by enemy kings, not by terrain, not by defeat, by his own army. That alone would have been enough to wound his legend. But the deeper damage was invisible, because from this moment on, both Alexander and his soldiers knew something they could never unknow again. He had limits, and they had power. But no one saw what came next, because the retreat westward did not heal the relationship between king and army. If anything, it exposed just how unstable everything had become. Alexander may have agreed to turn back, but he did not become gentler. He did not suddenly transform into a wise, contented ruler ready to shepherd his men safely home. He remained Alexander, restless, punishing, hungry for action, incapable of simple stillness. And that meant the return journey would become yet another theater of suffering. Rather than retracing the easiest route, Alexander chose a path that was itself almost a form of punishment. Some historians have debated his motives. Was it strategic exploration, ambition, pride, a desire to outdo mythic heroes, a need to reassert dominance after the humiliation at the Hyphasis? Perhaps all of it. But whatever the reasoning, the result was catastrophic. He led part of his army through the Gedrosian desert. And there, the rebellion that had stopped him in India took on a darker meaning, because even though the army had forced him to turn back, they still could not escape his capacity to drag them through hell. The Gedrosian March was one of the worst disasters of Alexander's campaigns. Heat, thirst, starvation, exhaustion, disorientation, and logistical collapse turned the journey into a nightmare. Men died not in battle, but in slow, degrading ways. Pack animals collapsed, supplies failed. Water became more precious than gold. Some accounts suggest women and camp followers perished in appalling numbers. Discipline itself became harder to maintain when bodies were shutting down and hope had thinned to almost nothing. This was not glorious suffering, it was pointless suffering, and that distinction matters, because soldiers can endure astonishing hardship if they believe it serves a meaningful end. But meaningless hardship breeds bitterness that can outlast fear. Imagine what the veterans must have felt. They had finally forced the king to turn back from endless conquest, only to find themselves dying in a desert, because he still could not simply choose the sane path home. If resentment had once been a whisper, by now it must have become a private certainty in many hearts. Alexander was no longer just the hero who won impossible victories. He was also the man who would never stop demanding more. Everything was about to change. And yet, even in this darkness, Alexander retained something almost supernatural in the eyes of many who followed him: presence, charisma, the terrible magnetism of a man who can still command loyalty even after causing unbearable suffering. One famous story from the desert captures this perfectly. Some of his men reportedly found a small amount of water and brought it to Alexander in a helmet. He looked at it, saw that there was not enough for everyone, and poured it into the sand, rather than drink while his men thirsted. It is one of those moments that historians debate in detail, but understand symbolically. Whether embellished or not, the story survived because it expressed a truth about why Alexander remained so dangerous as a leader. He did not ask of others what he would not also endure himself. That matters, because cruelty alone does not build enduring loyalty. Shared suffering does. Visibility does. The sense that the king is not hiding behind comfort while others die for him. Alexander bled, marched, thirsted, froze, and risked death beside his men. That did not erase the resentment, but it complicated it. He was not a soft tyrant ordering misery from a safe distance. He was a man dragging everyone, including himself, through his own impossible dream. And that made him much harder to hate cleanly. That is part of what makes this story so powerful. Alexander's army did not turn against a simple villain. They turned against a leader who was at once brilliant and destructive, inspiring and exhausting, heroic and terrifying. The rebellion was not against weakness, it was against excess, against the unbearable cost of following greatness too far. But no one saw what came next, because even after India, even after the mutiny, even after the desert, Alexander still had one more devastating collision coming with the men who had carried him across the world. And this time it would happen not at the edge of the empire, but near its center, when Alexander made a decision that convinced many Macedonians that he was no longer just changing, he was replacing them. When Alexander returned west from the nightmare of India and the ordeal of the Gedrosian desert, many in the army must have hoped that the worst was finally behind them. They had survived battlefields, mutiny, tropical storms, freezing passes, desert death, political executions, drunken bloodshed, and years of marching through lands most of them had never even heard of when they first crossed into Asia. They had given Alexander everything: youth, strength, brothers, blood, time, and whatever remained of the ordinary lives they might once have expected to live. Now surely, they must have thought the campaign would begin to settle. The king would consolidate. The empire would be organized. The old veterans would be honored. The long-promised return to something like home would finally come into view. Instead, Alexander did something that struck many Macedonians like a slap across the face. He began reshaping the empire in a way that suggested they were no longer its privileged core. And to men already bruised by years of sacrifice, that felt dangerously close to betrayal. Everything was about to change. To understand why, you have to understand Alexander's real imperial ambition. For years, many of his soldiers had imagined that they were conquering an empire for Macedon. That however vast and strange these new lands became, they remained in some essential sense Macedonian victories, won by Macedonian arms, commanded by a Macedonian king, and therefore belonging to the people who had bled to seize them. Alexander, by contrast, was moving toward something much larger and much more destabilizing. He no longer wanted to rule simply as a Macedonian conqueror sitting on top of Persian ruins. He wanted fusion. He wanted a new imperial order. An empire where Macedonian and Persian elites could be merged, where Eastern and Western customs could coexist under his personal authority, where loyalty would flow not through old tribal or ethnic lines, but directly toward him. From a strategic perspective, it was visionary. From the perspective of many of his veterans, it was infuriating, because they had not suffered through a decade of war to become just one group among many in a hybrid empire run by a king who increasingly seemed fascinated by the very world they had conquered. And then Alexander began making that transformation impossible to ignore. One of the clearest symbols of this shift came in Susa, where he staged one of the most astonishing and politically loaded ceremonies of his reign, the mass marriages. Alexander himself married Persian royalty again, strengthening his claim to continuity with the old Achaemenid line. But more importantly, he arranged marriages between large numbers of his senior officers and Persian noblewomen. This was not merely romantic theater or court spectacle, it was dynastic engineering, a deliberate attempt to bind Macedonian power to Persian blood, to create a ruling class whose future would be mixed, not purely Macedonian. To Alexander, this may have looked like the birth of a new world. To many of his soldiers it looked like the burial of the old one. Imagine being a veteran of Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, Tyre in India. Imagine having followed your king from the familiar fields of Macedon into a decade of endless violence. Imagine watching him now stand at the center of a glittering Persian-style court, marrying into the bloodline of the very empire you helped destroy, while urging his officers to do the same. What exactly had all that suffering been for? Had they conquered Persia? Or had Persia, in some strange and humiliating way, conquered their king? That question became harder to dismiss with every passing month. But no one saw what came next, because the real explosion was not the marriages alone. It was what Alexander did next with the army itself. He began training and elevating large numbers of Persian troops in the Macedonian style. This was practical, logical, perhaps even inevitable for someone trying to govern a giant empire. He needed manpower. He needed local integration. He needed forces who could help stabilize regions far from Macedon. But logic is not the same as emotional reality, and emotionally for many of the veterans, this looked like replacement, not reinforcement, replacement. These Persian recruits, sometimes called the epigoni, or successors, were trained in Macedonian methods, armed and disciplined in familiar ways, and increasingly presented as a meaningful component of the king's future military system. Alexander was not simply ruling Persians now. He was arming them to stand beside, or perhaps someday instead of, the men who had built his empire. That was explosive, because soldiers can tolerate hardship more easily than they can tolerate despicability. Once a veteran begins to suspect that all his sacrifice has made him useful only until a cheaper or more politically convenient substitute can be trained, loyalty becomes very fragile indeed. And remember, this was not happening in a vacuum. These were not fresh, secure, well-rewarded men reacting from comfort. These were aging warriors already burdened by fatigue, resentment, grief, and the sense that their king had been drifting away from them for years. So when Alexander's policies began to suggest that the empire's future might not belong, especially to them at all, the emotional reaction was volcanic. Everything was about to change. The breaking point came at Opus, in 324 BCE. Opus was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. No enemy cavalry was charging. No elephants thundered through mud. No foreign king stood opposite Alexander with drawn sword. And yet what happened there was one of the most dangerous confrontations of his life, because at Opus, the tension between Alexander and his Macedonian veterans finally erupted into open collective fury. The immediate spark was Alexander's announcement that older and wounded Macedonian soldiers would be discharged and sent home. On paper this might sound generous. A reward, a retirement,